I'm Stephanie Frederick. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the Associate Director of the Alberti Center for Bullying and Prevention. Welcome to our, I guess this is our first colloquium for the spring semester. It actually does feel a little bit chilly outside. The past couple of days here in Buffalo until our fingers tonight when we get snow. So that is very exciting. But I'm very excited to welcome Hannah Rapp, who is our new postdoctoral fellow for the Alberti Center for Bullying and Prevention. So we presenting our activity. So Dr. Rapp is basically presenting an exploratory youth domestic study considering the community of adolescents with developmental disabilities as secondary victims of bullying. And this is Dr. Rapp's dissertation study. So there's a great chance to hear a little bit more. So Dr. Hannah Rapp received her PhD in education and psychology at the University of Wisconsin Management. She currently works as a postdoctoral researcher at the Alberti Center for Bullying and Prevention. And her research is broadly intellectual learning and the potential of child well-being, economy, and brain. Before I let Hannah get started here, I just wanted to do a couple of housekeeping. So she's going to present for about an hour, and then we'll be back to the following. For those of you that are doing feel free to put any questions that you have for Dr. Rapp, and maybe there's a Q&A or the chat. We'll be monitoring those throughout, and we will ask those questions to Dr. Rapp. And then obviously for those in person, you'll be able to hear at the end. And also for those of you that are interested, we have two so make sure questions. And I think that is so I'm going to see this in a little bit as I'm going to try to do on Zoom so we just make sure that we can't make this stuff. Yes, we'll try to project. And again, if audio, if you're struggling with audio, we can also speak it out. But yeah, okay. Oh, no, I'm just moving. Oh, that's nice. Okay, okay. So yeah, projecting yours. Okay, so I mean, joining me and welcoming back to us. Hey everybody, this is me called a doctor. About a month and a half ago, and I feel so grateful to be invited to share my dissertation with today. Part of the just briefly about me, I am from Madison, Wisconsin. For basketball Madison is a 2022 business in the United States on the 2022 bodies of water. I came to the Alberti Center in January, and I graduated in December from the university. I originally studied forgiveness and self-management, so forgiveness being a under, forgiveness to help helping people. And so this is my forgiveness research, and then I have a picture of myself at my birthday with my husband and my mother is expecting
I just sent her to go get Bob because we've never had this issue before, so it's got to be something that maybe how this is connected.
Is anybody else having trouble hearing?
Yeah, unfortunately, can't really hear it.
Okay, I was just making sure it wasn't just on our end. Well, thank you, Stephanie.
What's the sound now? How does this sound? Oh, I'm too close. Okay. That's being sound. Everybody hearing me better? None.
Yeah.
I have an idea. Maybe I can move myself up and then I can move the camera up more.
Hey Bree, this is Tim.
Leave that. I'm just going to put this up for.
Hey Bree,
No. Okay, go talk.
Okay. If I can get it from here. It's not, it's being recorded. Okay, so to begin, all humans are inherently hundreds of thousands of relationships with other people. Therefore, the most frequent type of hurt that an individual experiences might not be hurt that is directed from another person at oneself, a hurt is that is directed at a loved one. This vicarious hurt is called secondary victimization. Trudy, a philosopher, defines a secondary victim as someone who experiences harm and they hear about being wronged by the other person. Secondary victimization is different than empathy, sympathy, and relationship behavior because it involves an interpersonal kinds of effective. So I can feel empathy for someone who's passively negative or sympathy for someone who's not producing honesty and really natural disaster, for example. But again, that was secondary victimization. Colloquium also differentiates secondary victimization from tertiary victimization, which is hurt that you feel when you identify with the person who is harmed in some capacity, so you can share the same religion or the same nationality. So if the user leader is harmed by another person, you might have a real emotional experience because you're a citizen of that nation, but that is not secondary victimization because you don't have a close bilateral relationship with that person. It follows that a secondary victim might also release community towards an offender in the process called secondary forgiveness. And secondary forgiveness looks a lot like regular forgiveness. So secondary forgiveness or forgiving someone that hurt and your loved ones, which would be supposed to. Whereas forgiveness is picking up resentment towards a person who offended you and fostering compassion towards them. There are two common misconceptions about forgiveness, and one is that if I forgive somebody and release the anger I have with them, I'm giving up on justice or fairness. And justice and forgiveness are two really separate processes, but oftentimes people think of them as being the same process. So I just wanted to give a scenario of different income. If my car is stolen by a person, I can give up resentment that I have for that person. I can be good with that person's life that led them to see in my car, but I can also report them. And so the reporting of that offense is a very public process, and then that private internal process is converging and the beginnings of that forgiveness process. One theologian has gone as far as to say that if you seek to make a person who is offending you suffer, you are seeking vengeance rather than pursuing justice. So they believe that it is like the justice, whether or not that's true, it might not be. Justice is different than being paid. Another misconception is that forgiveness is the same as reconciliation or restoring a friendship. And since then, Freeman, who is a psychologist who works with sociology, she probably would forgiveness, reconciliation, not the same processes, and that you can release, for example, reports from a different you without going back to it as if it's unsafe for you to begin. I wanted to talk a little bit about reconciliation because it also involves the other party apologizing usually or wanting to restore that relationship. Whereas forgiveness, you don't have to wait for that other person to take control of the situation, work on your own emotions, and forgive them without a second party doing anything. Okay, several studies have been done to measure the effects of forgiveness. There is like a broader meta-analytic review, but I just highlighted a few studies that I find inspirational. So, the first study, the Freeman study, was the one that incest survivors did a pretty old study to think that forgiveness from this population is both forgiving others has also been contributing to increased self-esteem, lower blood pressure, and increased anxiety and depression. And each of these things really interesting. For the huge one was with individuals who had been a spousal and even this year in the 40 or something. But what does the research tell us about secondary forgiveness? And there's a lot less research on secondary forgiveness. So first, a secondary victim might actually be less forgiving than a primary victim. So someone that's my family member, I might be less likely to give up that anger than if someone hurts me. And this phenomenon is called the third-party unforgiveness effect. And we had all very good social psychologists, and they started with a series of experiments to explore this. So in their first study, they gave this hypothetical scenario to a group of participants where they said, okay, imagine that your romantic partner cheated on you. How likely are you to forgive them? And then another group, they gave a hypothetical scenario where close to friends, romantic partner cheated on them. How likely are you to forgive this person? Now, the forgiveness beyond the individual, the primary thing of this was significantly high. And then they replicated this study with real life romantic partnership scenarios, and then later on there were more studies that replicated this event, these different types of events that happen besides there are factors that we can affect the likeliness of forgiveness and some of these can be intuitive and apology from the person who offended the primary victim, the time which passed with the offense, the severity of the offensive consequences related to it, no expectations for a trusting relationship between the offender and the victim, so the stranger offense and more likely to forgive than if someone parent or partner, the women be positively empathized with the offender. And then factors that increase secondary victimization include taking on an individual's problem as your own problem during a conversation or self-disclosure. The present study focused on a very specific type of offense, sort of specific because it's got a lot of broad subcategories, but that was bullying abuse. And bullying refers to an intentional behavior that hurts another person or puts another person under stress. And it might include physical or psychological, it might be physical or psychological, and is usually repeated, and there is usually a power imbalance. And bullying is a form of aggression, and it can come in many different types of bullying: physical, verbal, relational, and now cyberbullying, which is the use of technology such as phones to threaten or humiliate or post content that someone else doesn't want posted. Okay, so according to the CDC, the rates of bullying are the highest in middle school, followed by high school. So in a national survey of 24 million students, 1 in 5 students reported being bullied in grades 6 through 12. So this current study does focus on those adolescent years. And I want you to remember that 1 in 5 or 20%, because the next slide we're going to look at the rates
among individuals with disabilities. Okay, and so if you look at the middle school years, we see like kind of average 27%, and then high school years sort of average 18-19%. Bullying disproportionately affects individuals with disabilities. So I refer to this Blake study because it was a national longitudinal study, and it showed that in K through 12, students with disabilities were 1.5 times more likely to be victims of bullying abuse. So for every one student who's bullied, 1.5 students with disabilities are bullied. And I've seen studies that have 2 to 3 times, but they weren't nationally representative. And it also depends on the specific disability type. And even within a disability type, it can depend on the feature or characteristic of the disability that is more severe. So for example, in autism spectrum disorder, there was an increase in bullying, abuse, victimization, but it was more pronounced in individuals that had communication deficits. So it's interesting. In Blake's study, though, the rates of bullying and victimization for students with disabilities was 34.1% in middle school, so elevated beyond that 20% in the last slide, and 26.6% in high school. Blake et al. Found that emotional disturbance was the disability with the highest rates of bullying victimization. So almost like above half of the students who had emotional disturbance, which are like anxiety disorders, depression, conduct disorder, for example, individuals that sort of don't necessarily have features or an intellectual issue affecting their learning, more so than other things affecting how they learn, experience higher rates of bullying victimization. Let's do that. Okay. And again, there's a lot of literature on higher rates among individuals with autism spectrum disorders. And so the Klusterman study that I have specifically compares prevalence rates of bullying victimization compared to just regular learning disorders, and found elevated rates among individuals with autism spectrum disorders compared to that other group. The present study focused on a very specific type of relationship between the person who was the primary victim and the secondary victim, which was the parent-child relationship. So I was interested in the dynamics of the adolescent-parent relationship among parents who have individuals with developmental disabilities. So in this study, adolescents with intellectual disabilities specifically spent more social time with their family members instead of their peers. So you kind of have to know, for typically developing middle schoolers, high schoolers, they sort of split their time between their peers and their parents. But this is a bit different. And then in this study that looked at individuals with autism spectrum disorders, the relationship between a parent and the adolescent was characterized by an highly involved caregiving, which they called enmeshment. And these were behaviors that sort of took away from the autonomy of the individual with an autism spectrum disorder. So for example, feeling pressured to spend more of their free time with their family instead of other people was an enmeshment behavior. But unlike the relationship, or unlike enmeshment behaviors among typically developing students, where you see lower happiness when there's higher enmeshment, there wasn't lower happiness in these families. Okay, and then parents might also perceive their child as vulnerable or more vulnerable to bullying abuse because of their disability. So in this study, among individuals with autism spectrum disorders and their parents, the parents were significantly more worried about bullying abuse than the children were. So just because they have a disability, the parent might be on like heightened alert. Also, we know from the previous studies that you might spend, if you have a disability, you might spend more social time with your family, and you might have less peer relationships at school. And so we've seen in a bunch of different studies that having friends can actually buffer against bullying. Lack of friends might mean that you don't have individuals to stand up against bullies or dissuade bullies from approaching. And then this study was just among the general parent population, and parents were asked what they saw, why they thought individuals were bullied, just generally. And they thought it was because of individual differences between their kid and other kids, and they such as identities like sexuality, class, race, appearance, and also ability. Okay, so then I wanted to see if other studies had been done to show how parents had been affected by the bullying abuse that happened to their children. And I thought I would find more of these studies, but there aren't a lot of studies that look at how parents are affected. So I found 3. They all have sort of smaller samples, and they're either opinion surveys or they're interviews. Okay, so the first one by Harcourt was a survey that went out to 26 parents, and Harcourt found that parents' mental health was affected. So they reported feeling upset, frustrated, and powerless following a situation that involved bullying abuse with their child. They experienced physical outcomes like loss of sleep, stress-induced illness, excessive alcohol consumption, and exhaustion. 7 parents reported feeling a sense of failure and guilt to protect their kid. And 10 parents made comments related to increased tension within their home and stress between themselves or partners. Brown interviewed 11 parents of middle schoolers who had also been affected by bullying abuse. And Brown's study also found similar outcomes of negative emotions related to the bullying abuse. But Brown sort of pinpointed that these emotions became so heightened because of how the schools responded to the bullying abuse. So the initial hurt was sort of snowballed by feeling that the school failed to protect the child or listen. And this quote I found to be super poignant that a parent said in an interview, and it reads, "I told Mr. Vice Principal I can see why kids take guns to school because you guys can't do a damn thing." So that was a very mad parent. And then Herring interviewed 9 parents of children 14 to 16, and specifically after cyberbullying, and found very similar outcomes that the other 2 studies found that reflect secondary victimization of the parent. Okay, so this theoretical framework, Bowen's family systems theory, sort of helped me to contextualize why we're seeing the secondary victimization outcomes among parents following bullying abuse. Family systems theory demonstrates first that family members are emotionally connected. So they react to each other's changes in needs, expectations, and challenges. A parent and a child are seen as embedded as an emotional unit or an emotional oneness. So when a child gets stressed or angry or anxious, those feelings can infectiously spread to their parents and also to their siblings. The transfer of emotions from child to parent can be unhelpful if it escalates, if these emotions become escalated by the parent. So for example, in this study, a mother's stress moderated the association between bullying, victimization, and anxiety among young adults with autism spectrum disorders. So this individual was already affected by bullying abuse, but then their anxiety became influenced by their parents' anxiety. Oh, sorry. In other words, yeah, sorry. No, I do want to go to the next one. Family theory also suggests that parents' responses to bullying abuse are likely to influence their children's responses. Oh my goodness. So in this study, how a parent managed their anger regulation in front of their child in 6th grade was associated with the adolescent's problem-solving behaviors in 11th grade. So it can have developmental implications, even how when a parent is dialoguing with their child, how they react while their child is expressing themselves. They can react in anger if they disagree with something, or they can react in a neutral fashion and help the child to cope or problem solve. So why is this so important that we as parents promote these adaptive coping strategies and manage our anger. Children who engage in aggressive strategies towards bullying in this study, that was an observational study where they video recorded different interactions on a playground. So the aggressive strategies tended to prolong bullying episodes and were 13 times less likely to de-escalate the severity of aggression in an episode than children who use problem-solving strategies like avoidance, ignoring, and seeking help. Okay, so that was all the lit review. Sorry, we're getting into the study. That was really long. Okay, so what we've learned is that bullying disproportionately affects individuals with developmental disabilities. Parents have a different relationship with their adolescents who have developmental disabilities. They're more involved in the social lives of their kids. And only a handful of studies have considered parents' mental health outcomes related to bullying abuse. So that's why this is an exploratory study. It's looking at some gap, but obviously more studies are needed. So this is not the end all. So my research questions were, how are parents of bullied adolescents with developmental disabilities affected by bullying abuse? And then what factors from the literature we reviewed impact secondary victimization outcomes? And what has helped parents to manage their anger towards people and systems that contributed to that abuse? The research design was quite simple. It was an online survey that was a sample of convenience. And prior to taking the survey, the parents would have to indicate that their child was an adolescent when the bullying abuse occurred, that their child did have a developmental disability, learning disorder, or developmental delay, and that the bullying, they had to self-identify that the bullying had affected them in some way. And then they were given quantitative measures and open-ended questions. And I'm not going to go over all of these, but they'll be here in the slides that are online and on my dissertation. So the ones that I do want to point out is my secondary victimization outcomes, or the ones that I was focusing on, were forgiveness, aggression, which has subscales for anger and hostility, desire for revenge, and then hurt from an offense, which the wounds of injustice checklist is. And 3 of them were focused on an acute offense. So the parent would write out the offense and the person they perceived as perpetrating the injustice prior to taking the measures. And then the aggression one that it was just general anger or hostility. It wasn't specific to an event. And then there were 1-item questions that sort of focused on these factors from the literature, such as whether or not the child received an apology, or the parents' perceptions that their child was more vulnerable to bullying abuse. The wounds of injustice checklist was something that I derived because there is no measure that measures interpersonal hurt from an acute offense, from an acute interpersonal offense. And so I derived this measure from forgiveness therapy, which has the uncovering phase as its first phase, which is where an individual kind of reflects on how their life has been affected by an interpersonal offense. And there are 8 layers of pain that the psychologist, or my old advisor, sort of notes that individuals experience typically. And so for each of these layers, I created items to sort of capture that hurt that could come from an interpersonal injustice. So briefly, we have unhealthy anger, or anger that lasts months or years, and it can cause an individual to be inappropriately aggressive with people or lead to depression or other complications. Shame is what others think about you. So after an offense, if someone is talking or gossiping, that can add to the hurt. Guilt is your perception of yourself and whether or not you've lived up to your own expectations. So that could be like a parent feeling like frustration at themselves for not being able to protect their child. Depleted energy is, as it sounds, like devoting emotional energy to an offense. Cognitive rehearsals are these intrusive thoughts, like right before you're trying to go to bed or when you're doing an activity with your family and then the offense pops into your head. You don't want it there. Comparison to the offender is this thought about the offender versus comparing to the victim and thinking, oh, I have all these things that have happened to me and seemingly nothing has happened to them. And permanent change kind of encapsulates a lot of different things. So it could be a change in your quality of life, your social status, the loss of a relationship. For in the context of bullying abuse, it could be moving schools or classroom changes. And then an altered just world view is the lens with which you view the world. So your views of justice shift, your trust in individuals, or if you're religious, your faith in God might change because of an injustice with another person. And then I gave parents open-ended response questions that they could write as much as they wanted. So how did the experience of your child being bullied affect your well-being? Do you view your child as more vulnerable to bullying abuse when compared to children of their age? What helped you to manage your anger and resentment related to the incidents, which was only asked if they indicated they had anger. And then if they indicated the school hadn't handled the situation very well, I asked them, how could the school have handled it better? So those were those 4. And then it was a mixed method study. So I put the same amount of weight in numerical data as I did on textual data. And I used data was collected concurrently, and then I used triangulation. So I had like a table where I had each research question, and then I addressed how the textual data or the qualitative data method informs the quantitative measures and vice versa. And for the qualitative data, I did conduct a thematic analysis. So I read every response over and over again, and then I tried to find patterns inductively to create these themes. I did use deductive coding in one instance that I'll show you guys later. The parents were a homogeneous sample of mostly mothers. So 91% were mothers, and that really surprised me. And they were mostly straight, white, and had a college degree. The adolescents were mostly male. And then I did limit the amount. I took a checklist from the CDC's website that sort of lists all developmental disabilities. And I just allowed parents to check which ones applied to their kid. So there was a lot of overlap. For example, 30 children had been identified as having autism spectrum disorders. And then 24 of those children also had anxiety disorders. So it's hard to interpret this unless you look at each survey. And then 58% had been in special education at some point. The types of bullying offenses were primarily being made fun of or called names or insulted. One that's unique to individuals, I think, with developmental disabilities is taking advantage of the disability to make the child do things they shouldn't do. And this was really hard to measure the severity of the hurt, because in some cases the child did not experience hurt. They didn't know they were being bullied, but the parent did know they were being bullied, and so the parent experienced a lot of hurt. The average time since the bullying offense was 8.4 years, and the offending parties indicated by the parent were predominantly the adolescent's peers, but also teachers and school admins, parents of other children. And then this one parent wrote in Asperger's professional, and I didn't know where to categorize that, so I just kept their wording. How do parents experience secondary victimization was the first research question that I had. And this is just the bivariate correlation table. So, and my 4 outcomes that represent secondary victimization. And as you can see, forgiveness, that scale was out of 180, where the higher score was more forgiving, and they averaged 83. So that's lower than 90, the halfway point. So they had lower levels of forgiveness. They had lower levels of hurt. So that was the wounds of injustice. And then the average participant was not vengeful or aggressive at all. So the aggression scale actually, I think it goes up to 96, and the max score was 46. So I sort of just dropped the aggression you'll see moving forward in the regression models. And then the revenge score, the average score was a 9, And that one went up to 25. So the average parent wasn't feeling like they wanted to get back at anybody behaviorally. Okay, so this is an example of how I use triangulation to address how parents were affected. And oops, I had a highlight. And so the textual data was the qualitative column. So I did a deductive coding in only this instance where I started with that framework of those 8 layers of pain or those wounds from injustice. And I looked at parent responses and where they fit into that. And I found the majority of parents did talk about an altered just world view. So 30 participants expressed that they were more cautious or untrusting towards systems or people. A majority of these participants described changes in their trust towards the school system, administrators, or teachers. Participants appeared to be particularly affected by teachers who work with individuals with disabilities, whom parents had a greater expectation or expectations for greater sensitivity and support from. So as one parent stated, when we started the new school, I felt like I was unnecessarily aggressive with them before they even started. So this parent has this new lens with which they view the world. They're more cautious because of what happened to their child previously. And then for the altered just world view, that was also sort of reflected in the checklist, the wounds of injustice checklist, where they were able to check slightly agree to strongly agree on any of those 8. So I'm going to move forward. Because I also inductively coded this. So for the inductive coded, I didn't try to fit things into those 8. I just looked at what the most prominent patterns among parents were. And I found that affected mental health was how parents responded the most and how they were affected. And I listed their wording and how many parents used each word in their response on the right side. But I know I could collapse some of these, like fury and anger, for example, could be collapsed into the same. So how they were affected, their mental health, their relationships with others were harmed, and then they had significant lifestyle changes. Okay, so focusing on the mental health, parents described anxiety, distress, depression, and other emotions. 4 parents explained that they had to begin seeing therapists or counselors related to the incident, and 2 participants shared they had post-traumatic stress disorders related to their experiences. So I wasn't expecting clinical outcomes, so I didn't give, anxiety or depression measures, but moving forward for at least a small group of parents, that might be necessary. The second one that I was talking about was the relationships being harmed as a result of their secondary victimization. Participants described severed or strained relationships with the school personnel, 23, and then with a co-parent, their child or sibling or other household member, and with people in general. So many participants expressed relationships with school administrators, counselors, and teachers were harmed because these individuals did little to stop the bullying abuse, or they encouraged the bullying abuse, or they were the bully themselves. 8 parents actually removed their adolescents from the school into either online school, homeschool, or an alternative school. And then 2 parents tried to remove their kids, but it didn't work out for one reason or another. And then several parents also described the tension in their households. So there was tension for kind of 2 reasons. One was parents or partners would disagree on how to address the bullying abuse. And then the other was their adolescent would displace anger onto them. And then that just created tension among everybody in the household. So I have this quote from one parent who said, "This caused me stress, not as much that she was being bullied, but stress from my wife's emotions. My wife was extremely upset. that this was happening to our daughter, and this brought stress onto me. But yeah, the stress was very bad in the house because my daughter brought home her hidden emotion, or brought her hidden emotions home. Okay. And then lastly, the final theme was lifestyle changes, and 14 participants talked about lifestyle changes. And this describes how participants lost jobs, moved residences, spent time away from work, used up sick leave, were unable to start a position or move from part-time to full-time because of how the bullying abuse affected them. And these work-related changes also led to financial related changes in some cases. This is a really long quote, but it is so good, so I included it. So this participant said he was bullied on the school bus, and the only way to fix it was to start driving him to and from school every day just to get him off that bus. I talked to the school and they said there were no real other options. Driving him every day started in 6th grade and continued until he was a senior, 7 years. I feel like I lost 7 years of my life. I had no time to do anything other than that. I wanted to get a job and bring some money into the house, but I couldn't. Driving him every day for 7 years consumed my time. I started seeing a counselor and she said my diagnosis was that I was just exhausted and burned out. Not only did I drive him back and forth to school, but also to things like band practice and shows, medical appointments, counseling. I used to say if I wrote a book about my life, it would be titled Sitting in Cars and Parking Lots. Looking back, there is some sadness when I think about things I wanted to do, but I saved him emotionally, and that is priceless. Okay. Secondly, I wanted to see what factors affected these secondary victimization outcomes, and I focused on the forgiveness outcome and the hurt from an offense outcome. And secondary forgiveness was significant in both of these models. So if the parent perceived that their kid had forgiven the offender, they were more likely to forgive and experience less pain from the offense. For the wounds of injustice, if the child had a prior friendship with the individual who bullied them, the parent was more likely to experience pain from the offense. And then the parents' perceived vulnerability of their child increased the hurt that they experienced from the offense. I just move forward. Okay. I also asked parents specifically why they might perceive their child as more vulnerable compared to other kids their age. And 62% of participants, or 40, perceived that their adolescent was highly or extremely vulnerable to bullying abuse compared to their peers. And these are the themes that their patterns and their responses revealed. The most prevalent one was a social skills deficit, but also parents emphasized, like specifically mentioned the disability in 35 cases. In 22 cases, they didn't necessarily mention the disability, but they mentioned how their child was different or used a comparative statement. The communication difficulties was mentioned by 13 participants. And then we have physical attribute, environment. These responses were ones where they didn't really mention their child so much as my child is in a dangerous neighborhood, or the teachers aren't trained. That type of response is why the child's vulnerable. And then also inability to do a daily activity as others do. So an example quote for social skills deficit was, he has some behaviors: making nonsense noises, interrupting others, being louder than expected, fidgeting, bumping into others, talking about unrelated topics, tattling, and concerning himself with others' business that many would perceive as annoying. So I liked how that parent wrote that out. And then I asked parents if they felt that the school could have handled the situation better, what the school could have done. And I'm still collecting data on this one, because you'll see that there's no one theme that has the majority of parents. All parents had different perspectives on the situation. One of the themes was consequences for bullying. So for this one, some parents didn't think there were any consequences for the bullying behavior, or they thought that the consequences weren't harsh enough. I'll go into the proactive bullying, monitoring and prevention measures, was umbrellaed over also a lot of different subgroups of responses. So for this one, A lot of parents suggested school personnel increase the supervision of students. So for example, this quote, "They should have left my son's individual paraeducator with him at all times." 4 parents suggested creating or allowing physical separation between the bully and the victim. And 2 participants suggested proactive educational trainings for students regarding bullying abuse. And then the third theme that was kind of only 10 parents composed this theme was that participants sought improved communications with schools regarding the bullying abuse. So some parents had felt like the schools did not inform them that it was happening. And in one case, a parent explicitly asked for mediation between the 2 families involved in it. And in another unique case, a parent felt that having the IEP meeting helped them to communicate better with the school. Okay. And then finally, I wanted to know how parents who had felt anger, what helped them to manage that anger. And again, there wasn't one major theme for this. Parents were all over the place. I guess maybe the major theme was their child being safe now, based on there being 18 responses. So, for example, when the situation came to light, several teachers addressed the bullying and how disappointed they were. I feel like it was handled appropriately. So just having the school validate and respond in an appropriate way mitigated the parents' feelings of anger. Okay. So, I know I'm almost to the hour, so I'm going to go through these kind of quickly, but this is the important part. The recommendations. The biggest takeaway is that I feel this is understudied still, even though I've conducted this one study that was exploring parents' emotions and also individuals with developmental disabilities and bullying abuse. And so what I sort of concluded for this specific study was that if parents felt heard by schools, a lot of these secondary victimization outcomes were mitigated. And I wanted to refer to this earlier colloquium that the Alberti Center had, where Steve, one of the attorneys who defends the families, was saying that when families come to him, they initially have all of these harsher recommendations for consequences for the perpetrator and the bullying behaviors. And then once he listens to them, they start to lose their anger and have these less harsh consequences that they want for the other person. And so this is sort of how I felt. I sort of had the same thought that once anger is taken out of the picture, then parents can really think, you know, what's going to help my child be safe at school. And then also it's important to listen to the parents because they had such a wide variety of suggestions that they thought the school could have done to support their child better. So for example, an aid for their child, a social skills lunch bunch, to help their child improve their social skills and also make friends. And then teacher and student educations about autism. So just learning more about the features of this disability could have helped them in their perspective lessen their anger about that offense. So just having an open dialogue with the families and validating them. Another takeaway was that school personnel's responses are so important in general, and the literature does reflect this, that parents often, like the first line of defense that a child at school comes to, or that the offense is brought to, is usually a teacher or an administrator, and that historically seeking help from an administrator is associated with decreases in victimization and fewer internalizing problems among the victim of bullying abuse. And in the case of this study, 4 parents even mentioned that they felt less anger because of the help they received from teachers, IEP team members, and the superintendent. So I just wanted to bring about the importance of the school personnel. And then I had some recommendations for parents. So they documented feeling anxiety, stress, worry, guilt, depression, and in some cases even suggested clinical levels of some of these emotions. And then other parents felt very isolated. And so my first thought was, oh, mental health counseling, but sometimes mental health counseling isn't as accessible because you do go into a wait list, you do have to pay money for it. But I do believe that community support groups could offer some of the similar validation or processing with other people that parents found help them to be less angry, and they could feel less isolated. Their emotions could be normalized because they've all gone through the same situations. And then they could offer support to one another by sharing their experiences and what worked for them, what didn't work for them, and then just generally what strategies parents could have for respite in the case that a lot of the burden of this bullying abuse is just parent and child, but it does affect their whole household. So just making sure that they're taking care of themselves as well. And then for mental health counseling, if there are chronic levels of anger, I do suggest something like forgiveness therapy that kind of is giving the parent the decision to work on the process of forgiving and choosing not to hold on to resentment if they want to do so. And again, the average time since the offense was 8 years. So parents have been holding on to a lot of hurt for a long time. And forgiveness therapy has been shown to significantly decrease anger among severely hurting groups of people. Okay, so I have some resources. I had to do some research for these because I do think it's important to think about interventions that help decrease bullying behaviors. And so this first website is for teachers, and it's to help teachers talk to individuals they see in their classroom who are doing bullying behaviors. And some things to consider for the teacher is if the bully is also a victim of hurt. So maybe they have neglectful parents, or maybe they're being hurt by someone else in the classroom. Trying to understand where these behaviors are coming from, because we don't have bullies, we have persons who bully. And then if that individual has a social skill deficit and might not understand the implications of their behavior, and then also if that person doing the bullying behavior is wanting power control or status, and if there are more healthier options to sort of fulfill that desire for control other than the bullying behaviors. And then the second website is for parents and their communication if their child is being bullied. So it sort of talks about the steps of just being there and not questioning their child as they're telling you about what's happening, just sitting there, listening and accepting and validating, and also neutralizing your expression because they feed off of your emotions. And then sort of pointing your child towards problem solving. So listening to first what they think a good solution is, and not just jumping in with your solutions immediately and sort of promoting their self-advocacy of an issue. But then also you can see what, as a parent, you could have like the research to see what helps a child also. So not saying necessarily like to your kid, oh, just ignore the bully, because that's not, statistically, that doesn't always work if they're bringing that situation to you, or telling the bully, like, you made me feel X, Y, or Z way, doesn't work. So just knowing what to suggest to your child too. And then finally, that last link is a template for parents who need to email schools regarding bullying abuse. And so two things to consider here are who knows your child best, because you might not want to initially email an administrator who isn't familiar with your child's situation. And if your child has an IEP team member who's worked with them for a long time, that might be the first person to address. And then how to state best what happened and what you believe your child needs. So not necessarily going in with an emotional or blaming tone, but with like a logical, rational, XYZ happened. This is what support I would expect would help my child. Okay, I am over an hour, but I do have limitations and future directions. Just briefly, this was a small sample. There were not enough dads. Obviously it was a homogeneous sample. It was white educated moms. The bullying offense was considered an acute offense in how I measured it, but it's an offense that spans time. And so I did have to conduct a sensitivity analysis because some parents didn't put an acute time, they put a number of years. And so I would look at, removing those 11 cases versus averaging the time since the offense versus taking the most recent offense. And then the severity, I sort of talked about, I need to incorporate the parent's perspective because again, the severity in the point of view of the child, it might not be severe or they might have not even considered it bullying. Future directions, I am still collecting survey data right now. And then I do hope to have some sort of way to numerically measure family systems approaches or the involvement or validation of parents so that I can look at how that factor relates to parents' mental health outcomes. And then community support groups. I'm very interested in probably reaching out to NAMI or someone who already has a model of a support group for families and figuring out if there is a way to start a support group for individuals who have experienced bullying abuse and need to process it with others who've gone through that. Specifically for parents of individuals with developmental disabilities. And then future replications. If I had to change something, I would have asked parents, I would have tried to have participants who had the bullying abuse within the past year. So they'd be kind of at the same time point because the 8 years, there were a lot of snowballing consequences from the initial offense. So it was really hard to put them all on the same ground. And then also recruiting participants whose children have the same developmental disability. I'm specifically interested in emotional disturbance right now because it is a disability that doesn't have visible features. And it has a 51% reporting bullying victimization rate. So those are where my thoughts are at right now. Okay, that's the end. If you have any questions about anything, please ask them. I know I had to rush through a lot of stuff. Yes. Oh,
I'm sorry, go ahead. Did someone have a question?
oh,
Did you want to talk first?
I was just gonna say that we have about 15 minutes for questions. We do have several from the Zoom audience.
Oh.
So we have a lot of questions, so please go ahead.
Your last point about working more with kids with like emotional disabilities. I was wondering, these kids are often what Dorothy Espelage refers to as provocative victims. So yes, they're subject to a lot of victimization, but they also can bully back and do some harmful things. Have you looked at like how parents perceive that or work with that or respond to that at all?
yes. Well, okay. So in the vulnerability responses, I almost felt like without stating it explicitly, parents definitely felt like they had provocative victims. Let me go back to it. Like statements like kids say she is weird, or like statements like that where parents understand that their child just might be passively provoking just in who they are, or maybe not even passively, maybe they are doing like an interrupting or a noise that annoys somebody, or they're fidgeting behind someone while they're taking a test. So I haven't looked into it, but I definitely see that in responses where it's not just it's a more complex issue than just, oh, there's a victim and there's someone doing the bullying behaviors. But I do think that should be considered in interventions for sure. And in, I was at first really interested in restorative justice because it takes into the perspective of not just the bully and the person who's bullying and the person who is receiving the bullying, but also the perspective of like the teacher and also the parent of the other child who might hear a different story, or just everybody has so many different stories that could add to the information about this issue. And I only looked at parents of the victim. So I feel like, yeah, I'm not getting the full complexity of that. And specifically with kids who have disabilities, that's very important.
Yeah, because I can see the parent being upset too, is, you know, your kid did something, but then your kid was also less able to defend themselves, targeted for that, maybe didn't understand the gravity of what they said or did. So having supports for families, so thank you. It's
Yeah.
really interesting.
And in some of their solutions, the parents talked about specifically wanting social skills trainings for their kids. So that also sort of infers that they might think, oh, this would have made it better if my kid had this lunch bunch where they could practice X, Y, or Z, or that type of thing.
So, we do have a couple from the online audience. So one of the first questions was, and you might have to bring up a table for this one, but it was a question regarding I think it was your first research question. Why do you think the level of aggression in parent participants was so low? And they indicated only 44 was the highest score.
Yeah. I think it is a consequence of the measure for aggression. I can actually probably share that because I have my dissertation pulled up too. But I feel like the questions that they asked related to aggression were not specific to an offense, but they were just the general personality traits of that parent. So sort of like, oh, I frequently lose my temper would be an example item. Actually, I can read an example item. I have. Oh my goodness, sorry. Oh, yeah, I have trouble controlling my temper. At times I feel I have gotten the raw deal out of life. So I feel like that's why the aggression one might have been lower, because it was trait aggression. And then for the revenge one, that was a very short, I think it was only 5 questions. And it was things like very extreme statements, like I want him to get what she or he deserves. I wish something bad would happen to him or her, referring to that person who was viewed as doing the injustice. And I don't think the parent wanted necessarily bad things to happen to the peer of the person who committed the peer who offended their child. I think they more so wanted restoration in other ways other than behavioral revenge. So I would have probably not used such a behavioral scale in the future, because I feel like it wasn't a good measure for how parents were feeling.
Thank you.
You keep reading another question, if that's okay. So another question, do we know if parents experienced any bullying themselves as children or adolescents? This may be possible because many conditions, such as ADHD, are genetic. Perhaps seeing a child teased may be triggering memories for parents who were teased themselves. Are there any data on this? Maybe parents who were versus were not bullied themselves respond differently to seeing their child bullied.
So I did not ask parents about their own past history with bullying abuse. I did read an article by Amanda that did look at parents' experiences with bullying abuse and if that impacted the strategies they use to address bullying, and also their concern over the bullying situation. And I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, that if they were if the parent had been physically bullied, that not relationally or verbally, that's when they showed higher levels of concern, and that none of the past bullying experience of the parent affected the coping strategies or like the problem solving strategies that they recommended their kids. So that's what I know about that. But in this particular study, I don't know parents' past experiences.
Another question, did you find that students who did the bullying, were they general education students or were they students who also had a disability? I'm not sure if you have that information.
No, that would have been really interesting though, to ask more questions about that.
And then this one is more of a comment, so I don't know, than a question. But one person said there's a lot of nuances to the cases, yet when parents feel heard, there is less angst, grief, and safety worries. And they also indicated that lunch bunches, so I think they're referring to the kind of social skill type groups that happen during schools, during lunch hours, are incredibly important. Just some comments there that they wanted to share.
Yeah, I concur.
There is one more question, but I don't know if anyone has a question here. Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your research. I have a question about the two dependent variables that you use in the full regression.
Yeah.
So did you check the correlation with the dependent variable? So somehow they.
Yeah, I know that actually is that was like wait, where did I go? Here, okay, so that's actually a weird thing that I did because it was an exploratory study. Even when some of those independent variables didn't correlate, I still kept them in the model to see if they offered explanatory power because they were in the literature as relating to these outcomes. So then part of me collecting more data right now is that the power isn't strong enough basically to show if something was significant with only 64 participants in the model and having 12 independent variables. So I think in the future, you can use this to look at relationships between them, but I would not use these as predictive models necessarily with this small sample and like the end all of what really makes a parent forgive. But yeah, I didn't remove the non-correlated, and some of these didn't significantly correlate with forgiveness. If that answers your question.
Oh yeah, I asked the question because if the dependent variable, the two of them correlated, then that should be taken into account. So like the multivariate regression analysis might be instead of multiple regression.
Oh, you're saying if like forgiveness and hurt
Right.
correlated. Yeah, that is another concern too. I was pretty happy with the moderate correlations because you kind of see overlap in dependent variables. If they're like a 0.8 or above, you're kind of seeing the same thing. But these were between 0.36 and 0.62 was the strongest one, and that was between revenge and forgiveness. So I felt like there was enough nuance between these constructs, even though they're still related underneath the umbrella of secondary victimization. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, we've got one more from the online audience. They're very involved, which is wonderful. How could communication supports be implemented to help those who are vulnerable to more bullying as a bullying prevention measure?
Communications between the school and the parent, or between the individual who might have a communication deficit and needs to communicate that something's happening.
I'm not sure. I think either.
The question is for supporting the individuals who are bullied.
I think a little bit about like when you were talking a little bit about like the social skill deficits and things like that, that makes up like those individual traits that maybe make someone more vulnerable. Are there potentially ways to maybe boost like appropriate communication, appropriate social skills, maybe? If you have any thoughts on that? like more preventative teaching type strategies for these students with disabilities?
Yeah, oh man, I've been reading things. I don't have a great answer, because I was trying to find interventions specifically that looked at reducing bullying victimization among individuals with developmental disabilities before I spoke today. And I only found one for Second Steps. And the Second Steps program sort of focuses on just generally teaching individuals how to regulate their emotions and how to have more empathy. But I don't know if there's any, and I've also seen a lot of research on how to modify existing preventions and interventions that make them more inclusive of individuals with developmental disabilities. There's one meta-analysis, but it only has like 12 interventions that had been modified. And it wasn't significant, like it didn't show differences in results that reduce bullying victimization among individuals with developmental disabilities. So I'm still looking into that question myself. Like, how can we support these individuals? The UB answer would be AI. I don't know.
I will say that Chad Rose at University of Missouri, who was one of our past early career award winners and has given a colloquium, he does a lot of work a lot of his research has been looking at individuals with disabilities and the bullying dynamic and social skills, but more recently, he's really focused on doing more of those social skills interventions. I don't know how much he has yet published on that, but he's a potential good resource if somebody wants to look more into that aspect as well.
So that, I think we're at time, so it's 12:45. So if we could maybe join me in thanking Hannah one more time. And then before we end, I just wanted to mention our next colloquium, which is going to be held Tuesday, April 2nd. We have Dr. Chris Lang, who is coming from Lehigh University. The colloquium is going to be on race-centered trauma responsive schools approach, pathway to racial healing. And that is going to be actually held at Best Self is at downtown Buffalo, right? In downtown Buffalo. And that will also be a hybrid event. So in person, lunch will be served, and then a light lunch will be served, and then Zoom will be available too. And then there is a survey that Bree will send out to all of our in-person attendees and has been put in the chat for our online attendees. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and I hope everyone has a good rest of your day. Thank you so much.